Hi, my name is Cathy English. I'm the curator of Revelstoke Museum and Archives. I was born at Trail, BC in 1956. I grew up in Castlegar. Then in 1978, I moved to Revelstoke. And so I've lived on the Columbia River all of my life. I just moved upstream. I started working at the Revelstoke Museum in 1983. And even then, I didn't really have a sense of the story of the river or the people who lived here. But I began hearing more stories of people who lived south of Revelstoke in what the locals call the flats. I saw the effects of the dam when I first moved here before they started planting grass in the valley. And you'd see the dust coming up, and if you put your clothes out on the line and saw a dust storm moving up, you'd have to run out and get your clothes back in. Otherwise, you'd have to wash them again. And I can still feel the grit of the sand on my teeth. That's before they did the mitigation to plant grasses in the valley to stop the dust from coming up. Started hearing stories of people who'd lived here before the dam and really started to make that connection. And the funny thing is that I grew up in Castlegar when they were building the dam, but it didn't really occur to me how it was going to be affecting people all the way up to my new home, all the way up to Revelstoke. What I was finding, talking to people who'd moved here more recently, is that they didn't understand the history of the river. They didn't understand the land that had been lost. They didn't understand the effects of the dam. In fact, a lot of people had no idea that our fluctuating water levels are even caused by a dam 230 kilometers south of town. A lot of people actually believed that it was caused by the Revelstoke Dam, which is north of Revelstoke. So I just became aware that it was a story that needed to be told. I'd hear people talking about going down on the flats, where we are right now, and they'd go down here to walk their dogs or ride their bikes or have parties. But there was no real sense of an understanding of people having lived here and this having been an agricultural valley. I really thought that was an important story to tell. That's why we created the exhibit at the museum, Stories Beneath the Surface. And I thought the title was really apt because there are so many stories that have gotten buried behind the reservoir of the Hugh Keenleyside Dam, and wanted to find a way to honor those stories, honor those people's lives and their way of life that had been lost. And even later, I came to realize the stories of the Indigenous people who lived in this valley. For many years, when I first started working at the museum, I would hear, oh, there weren't really Indigenous people here. They didn't like the snow and they were afraid of the mountains, so they never really settled here. They might have gone through occasionally, they might have hunted and fished, but there was no settlement here. And it really came to realize that that was just simply not true, that there was Indigenous settlement all through this valley. The Sinaiaks people, also known as the Lakes people, inhabited this land for thousands of years. They knew it intimately. They've got stories about it. They've got it was their whole lives revolved around the river and the tributaries of the Columbia River, and learned what those stories were and learned how to tell them so that we could honor the Sinaiaks people and honor their connection to this lake, and to the river. It just became really imperative that we tell these stories. In the middle of a climate crisis, it's just imperative that we understand how important our landscape is to our very lives and how important the river is to our lives. We have to honor that, and we have to find a way to bring the river back to life, to heal it. There was so much life and settlement in this valley. The Sinaiaks were unfortunately displaced from their land very early, and European settlement took its place. But there were people living all through here. Right where we're standing was the part of a Ukrainian community known as Mount Karshay, because it's at the base of Mount Karshay. There were probably at one point 200 or 300 people living in the settlement of Mount Cartier. They all had large acreages, they had farms, they had their own church down here, they had their own school, they had a cemetery. They had a vibrant lifestyle. They celebrated their Ukrainian heritage with their music and through their culture. There were other communities farther south where the ferry crossed the river at 12 Mile. There were families living on both sides of the river there. There was a smaller community north of here called Greenslide. There was one farther south called Wigwam. There was Sidmouth and Hall's Landing. Hall's Landing was named after a family that had settled there in the 1890s. And they had a huge farm operation. They had a cattle farm and were just really well known throughout the valley for their farming, for their cattle. And they had to leave their farm when the area was when people were told they had to leave because of the Hukinleyside Dam. All of these farmers had to leave their way of life. They had to leave their animals behind. There were a lot of other farmers that were displaced and had to leave their way of life, their job that was satisfying to them, that they were making money at, and had to leave it. The people of Mount Cartier had to leave their forebears under the ground in the cemetery that was covered over with concrete. They had to leave them down there. There's a single marker in the cemetery now with the names of the people who were buried in that cemetery. But you look around at the cemetery, and at a regular marker there'll be a name, there'll be a date, there'll be maybe where they were from, there'll maybe be an inscription, a Bible passage or something that spoke about that person. The Mount Cartier marker at the cemetery now has the names, and that's it. So that was one of many things that was lost when people had to leave their community. So what would be a happy ending for the Columbia River? I think part of it is that we, especially in the face of the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing throughout the world, we need to look at how can we heal this river? What things can be done to bring it back, if not to its natural state, at least back to some form that is better than what it is now, where it can sustain more agriculture, where it can sustain more life, where it can sustain more species. I think one of the things that's being talked about with the current negotiations is how to find ways to lessen the abrupt fluctuations of the reservoir above the Hukinleyside Dam. Does it need to be the abrupt and huge fluctuations that we currently experience now? Maybe that's one way that can be looked into to see if there possibly restore more land that could be available for agriculture, make it a little less precarious for some of the species that have established here. Of course, there's a lot of work done to try to reintroduce salmon in the Columbia River. I think that would be a really important way of healing the river, healing the people who have lost so much along the river. I think any measures that can be taken towards restoring the salmon, towards restoring any other species, I think is a really important move. And I think we just all have to be water keepers. We all have to be aware that this river belongs to all of us. Its health is reflective of our health and the health of our planet. The Columbia River Treaty was first negotiated in 1961, and by 1964 they had worked out some major issues between the two governments, the U.S. and the Canadian government, and that allowed the treaty dams to be constructed. But I think the important thing that was missing in the original Columbia River Treaty was any kind of consultation. There was definitely no consultation with Indigenous people. There was little to no consultation with any of the settler population. So I think moving forward with the renegotiations of and modernization of the treaty, the important thing is to look at how can people be involved in this process. And there definitely is a lot more consultation going on now, and the Indigenous people have been invited to the table. I think that's key to moving forward.